Hello, family. First, let me just say hello to all of my family that's watching all over the world, to those in Ghana and West Africa, Brother Scholar, and all the others there in the town of Sankagra, where I serve as sub chief, to my son in South Africa, and to all of you who have gathered here on tonight. I felt inclined to speak for a few moments so that we can get a clear understanding of what is happening in the country, and so that we can move forward with wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Over the last 2 weeks now, or better, there have been massive protests all over the world around the lynching of George Floyd. As we have watched it, many of us have become very excited about what we see, and rightfully so to a degree, because not only are African Americans out in the streets protesting, but there are whites and other ethnicities who have joined in. I must say that while I am hopeful, I do not have a lot of hope for any drastic or major changes in the nature of white supremacy in America and in the world. If we understand that white supremacy was developed and organized and instituted to maintain and to extend and expand white supremacy all over the world, I don't think a few demonstrations in the street will change a system which has been in place now for 500 years, a half of millennium. And because this is not my first rodeo, all of us can recall all of the things that have occurred over the centuries, if you will, that gave the impression that there was going to be a great change in America. During the Emancipation Proclamation, many former slaves were heard to say, no longer will there be slavery in America. Slavery has been abolished forever. We saw what happened with Rodney King. We saw the Prince of Peace, Martin Luther King, who was assassinated, even though he talked nothing but love and nothing but peace. We saw Emmett Till get body mangled and his face contorted and destroyed. We saw all of these things, and yet white supremacy rolled on as it has for the last 500 years. I had the opportunity, many of you know, I had the opportunity of doing a eulogy for two great African American women. This is the 100-year celebration of women's suffrage. And God blessed me and so honored me to do the eulogy of two great African American psychiatrists, Dr. Elise Galati and Dr. Frances Quest Weldon. When I was in journalism school at Ohio University, I was taught that when you write an article, that first paragraph include the four W's and the H. Who, what, when, where, and how. Who's talking, what they're talking to, when they said what they said, where it was done, and how it occurred, so that if a person did not have the opportunity to read the complete article in that very first paragraph, they would get the meaning and the thrust of everything that had occurred, when it occurred, where it occurred, what happened, what was all about, and how did it happen. So in these few minutes, brothers and sisters, I want to share with you, first of all, Dr. Galati, who was a member of Union Temple for over 40 years and was an accomplished psychiatrist. She spoke before the American Psychiatric Association in Miami, Florida in 1969. In that speech, she told the what of white supremacy. In a speech titled The Subtleties of White Racism, she gave a clear picture of what white supremacy and white racism is. 1 year later, Dr. Frances Welsing, with her crest color theory, gave the why of white supremacy. So the two of them, which I will highlight in a very few moments, will give us the what and the why, and then I will give you the who, the when, and the how, in that order. Because so many people have been quoting the speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King over the last 12 days or so, I thought it important to read a portion of a speech that was made by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1967. The speech was made about 3 weeks after about 150 riots in the United States, where 43 people were killed in Detroit, Michigan. That speech gives the real spirit and the real thinking and the real mind of Dr. Martin Luther King. So I would like to share that speech with you. As I share that speech, I would preface it by saying that Dr. Carol Anderson, in her classic volume, White Rage, said this. She said, every time Blacks have made demands for full citizenship, a formidable array of policy assaults and legal contortions have consistently punished Black resilience and Black resolve. Their assault, if you will, has caused the suffering of Blacks in many forms: fear, profound lies and deception, psychological trauma, chronic illnesses, undignified display of Black bodies and Black people, and intractable pain and death. So then, as I look at the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, spoken after the riots in 1967, where there were riots in 150 cities, Dr. King said, 1,000,000 words will be written and spoken to dissect the ghetto outbreaks, but for a perceptive and vivid expression of culpability, I would submit 2 sentences written a century ago by the French abolitionist Victor Hugo in the 1800s. Hugo said, and I'm quoting Dr. King's speech now, if the soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. Dr. King goes on to say, the policymakers of white America have caused the darkness. They created discrimination. They created slums. They perpetuate unemployment and ignorance and poverty. It is incontestable and deplorable that Negroes have committed crimes, but they are derivative crimes. They are crimes born of the greater crime of white society. When we ask Negroes to abide by the law, let us also declare that the white man does not abide by the law in the ghettos. Day in and day out, says Dr. King, he violates welfare laws to deprive the poor of their meager allotments. He flagrantly violates building codes and regulations. His police make a mockery of law. He violates laws on equal employment and education and the provisions for civic services. The slums are the handiwork of a vicious system of the white society. Negroes live in them, but do not make them any more than a prisoner makes a prison. Let us say boldly that if the total slum violations of the law by the white man over the years were calculated and were compared with the law breaking of a few days of riots, the hardened criminal would be the white man. Many people point out that there have been years of some progress, and that is true. Yet equally true is the fact of an animalistic action by a significant section of white society. In the midst of the progress, Negroes are still being murdered and lynched as they were over 300 years ago. From the beginning of slavery, blacks have been told that there are limits to their progress, that they must expect to remain permanently unequal and permanently poor. This is not Malcolm X speaking. This is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King speaking. And I can agree and concur with Dr. King wholeheartedly that the property destruction that you saw over 10 or 11 days of protests pale in comparison to the centuries of destruction of the minds, the spirits, the dreams, the goals, the aspirations of millions of African Americans. So when you saw President Trump hold up a Bible the other day, that was a good picture of what has propelled and supported white supremacy throughout its almost 500 years, not only in America, but throughout the world. When he held up the Bible, he was holding up the instrument that has been the handmaiden of white supremacy, which has been part of making the greatest conquest of the European, the conquest of the African man. A short look at the history of white supremacy, because as we have seen all the things that have occurred, and yet after all of those things that we have seen, and even now, I want you to understand, first of all, that what has caused America and many whites to stand up today is because what occurred has been seen all over the world. Just like in the demonstrations of the 1960s, when black men and young black men and boys and girls were being beaten with sticks and showered with floods of water and had dogs sicked on them, it was the media showing the video clippings of that violence against black people that was shown all over the world. So that if there was any ounce of humanity, it caused people to remark, here is a nation that speaks about human rights, and yet it is acting so beastly and animalistic toward black people in America. So what you have seen in the last few days is the same thing. People all over the world. This is why you see demonstrations of people who have witnessed and experienced white supremacy, but had not had a visible display of it, a lynching in live, living color for the whole world to see all over the world, which has caused some lawyers in America to do even as Paul, our dear brother Paul did a long time ago, some years ago, the great actor, I can't call his name right now, it escapes me, but you know who I'm talking about. The great actor who attempted to go before the United Nations, and then Malcolm, who did the same thing, and Black United Front, who proposed to do the same thing. There are those who are intending to go to the United Nations. So all these nations who look at America, who says that they are opposed to the violations of human rights in Hong Kong and other places, and yet they see the acts that are taking place here in America. But I want you to look at the record and see how even in the face of proposing, even right now, Congress is not talking about dismantling white supremacy. But I heard Congressman just an hour or so ago saying we're trying to determine how we're going to react to what happened. They're not talking about changing the system, a system that was organized to maintain and to expand white supremacy all over the world. Look for a moment at the history. First of all, 246 years of chattel slavery, so-called because chattel has its roots in the word cattle, when black men and women in America were made slaves and treated like cattle, buried in the ground, as T.L.R. James talks about in his book, The Black Jacobins, buried up in the ground up to their necks in soil, and then let loose bees and flies after honey was poured and molasses were poured on their heads so that the flies and the bees could eat the flesh off of their face, rammed dynamite up their rears and then lighted it so it would explode, gave them 100 lashes and then laid them beside the fire so that cats would come and scratch the blisters open and then pour salt and pepper in the wounds. Do you know where the word MF came from? Calling somebody MF. It came from a young black man being taken from his mother and then at an age of a teenager brought back and thrown into a cabin and made to have sex with his mother. And after he finished, being told that, boy, you are an MFer because you just had sex with your mother. In slavery, when we were finally released in 1865 with nothing but rags on our ancestors' backs, they could not even fish or hunt. And so then, roaming the streets trying to find family, they were put back into slavery by another name because the black codes were introduced. 3 or 4 years of black codes from 1865 to 1868 or 69 that was so wicked it couldn't last but a certain period of time. But slave owners, for any reason, former slave owners could arrest a black man and charge him with a crime. Then a fellow slave owner was the judge who would conduct a fine on that black man which he could not pay. And then that slave owner would say, I'll pay the fine, put him back into slavery by another name where he had to work off the $25 fine or the $50 fine. After slavery by another name through the black codes, then 100 years or 90 years of sharecropping. In sharecropping from 1865 to 1955, black men without the ability to hunt or fish and without any means of subsistence had no choice but to go back to the same former slave owner who instituted slavery by another name in the form of sharecropping. And then he had to rent the plow and rent the mule and rent the land and rent the seeds, and then on credit at the end of a season, unable many to count and properly figure what they were owed. Most made nothing, and so that they would go right back into sharecropping that lasted for 90 years. Then 104 years of criminal leasing, because once again, black men from 1843 all the way up to about 1952, you know about the prisons in Alabama that became the feeding plant for digging out the coal for the coal mines, so that the great companies like Carnegie and U.S. Steel could make millions of dollars and billions of dollars. Then 19 years of the Homestead Act and the Land Redemption Act between 1843 and 1862, when whites in America were given 160 acres of land free. And then couple of years later, in the Land Redemption Act of 1862, given another 162 acres of land for only $1.25 an acre. And then we know about that point when whites could claim land out west, out in Oklahoma and other parts in the Midwest, all they had to do at an appointed time was go across the line and put a stake in the ground. That's where the whole idea of stakeholder came from. They could put a stake in the ground and claim the land. Of course, many of them went across before the date that was assigned for them to cross the line into Oklahoma. And that's where we get the word Oklahoma sooner from, because some crossed the line and stuck a stake in the ground to claim some land sooner than they should have. After that came, for just a short 7 months, we got reparations. In 1865, 21 black preachers met in Savannah, Georgia, with General Sherman after he had gone through the South and completed the last battle, defeating the plantation owners. Here were these, because slaves could roam and join in and be free as concubines when any city was conquered. Here General Sherman was with his own troops, plus 4,000 free slaves following his army. He couldn't feed all of them. So he wrote to Washington, to Lincoln, and said to President Lincoln, I got all these slaves following my army. I can't feed them all. What am I going to do with them? Lincoln sends his Secretary of War, Stanton, down to Savannah, Georgia, and asked these 21 preachers, well, what do y'all want? The 21 preachers said, we want land. And they were given 330 miles of land. Every former slave, all the way from South Carolina down through Georgia to Florida, on the water, so they could irrigate their land. They didn't have any mules to plow the land, so General Sherman allowed them to use his military mules. But after Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, who had great bitterness that poor whites had been relegated to an inferior status, he took the land back from the former slaves who had reparations only for 7 months, and then were given back to the same harsh treatment. And so after that came the 30 years of the Federal Housing Act, or Federal Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1934, that made low down payment, long-term mortgages available to whites only. That was the redlining, which you know about, where maps where blacks live were literally painted red, and HUD demanded that every bank not make a loan to any black person. We know that real estate is the primary means by which any black person, so that from 1934 to 1964, blacks could not participate for the most part in the Federal Housing Act. Then after that came Social Security in 1934, so that from 1934 to 1954, blacks could not participate in Social Security to give them some kind of relief for their work and for their labor. The excuse they used was that blacks, because they worked in domestic work and farming, they could not calculate what they were owed in terms of health benefits, in terms of work benefits from Social Security, so that from 1934 to 1954, blacks were denied the right to participate in Social Security. Now I got a question for you. I'm going to try to finish this up in the next 10 minutes, so don't go anywhere. I got to ask the question about who were these people who put their hidden fingerprint on the history of America. Who developed this hidden history? Who were the whites that Martin Luther King was talking about when he said that there were a significant section of whites who had an animalistic behavior? Who were those who had the hidden fingerprints that Dr. King said created unemployment, created the slums, created inequality, created racism, created white supremacy? To understand this, we need to quickly understand how white supremacy was established in America. When America was established, a few rich white men looked to create more wealth. And so they came to America. They first chose poor whites who were on the streets of Europe, who they called the offscourings, which is another word for human waste. They despised these poor whites so much, they called them human waste. And later in history, they called them white niggers. They said they were worse than black niggers. Many of them were in prison for 20 years, 30 years, for life. They let them out of prison. They let them come to America. They came to America. They said, they called it indentured servitude. They said, if you work for us for 7 to 11 years, you can go free. And of course, those who had been in prison and those who had lived on the streets of Europe, hungry and haggard, without food and without shelter and without clothing, the homeless of Europe would have loved to come to America as they did and work for free for 7 and 11 years and then be given some corn and some land. Well, they came and they worked, but a little, but they were lazy. They didn't want to work. They didn't want to do the work that was necessary. Then these rich whites discovered the crop called tobacco in the Barbados. And they also discovered some hard-working people called the Africans, and they brought our ancestors to America once again as indentured servitude and said to those slaves, you can work and you will be free. At this time, these poor whites and the slaves that had been brought as indentured servants from Africa were beginning to outnumber the few rich who had come here to develop more wealth in America. So they began to collude. They said, we outnumber these few rich and we can take over and we can get that which they promised us, which we have not gotten. But when they tried to collude, the few rich said, we've got to make a divide between these poor whites and these blacks that we brought here as slaves. So they said to the poor whites, we have created you and brought you here, but you are better than these blacks, and tricked the poor whites and made them think they were better until 1670, when a black man by the name of Antonio Johnson became very wealthy. He had acres and acres of land. He bought his wife's freedom. He bought his children's freedom. And so the poor whites said, well, you say we are better than blacks, but look at Antonio Johnson. He's got all this wealth. He's got all these land. He's even got white slaves. So how can we be better than him? It was then that Virginia, in Southampton County, Virginia, where Anthony Johnson lived, passed a law that hereafter every black person born in America, in Virginia, will be a slave for life. The other southern states followed. And so from that point, blacks became slaves for life. And as they became slaves for life, blacks in America found it very difficult. And as they looked at the way that they were being treated, they saw the great rebellion that took place in Haiti, where the Haitians were able, in a war that started with the French in 1791 and that lasted to 1804. The French had their sophisticated weaponry, but the Haitians whipped them from one end of Haiti to another. After that, as slaves were brought from the Caribbean into Louisiana, the word spread in America among the slaves about this great rebellion that had taken place in Haiti. And so in 1800, Gabriel Prosser began to organize for a rebellion. He said, and I quote, no more harm to kill a man who's trying to kill you than to get a drink of water when you're thirsty. Then in 1822, Denmark Vesey called for violence if slavery was not abolished and blacks were not treated better. And so then David Walker, in Walker's appeal in 1829, he said that they keep slaves uneducated because to be uneducated would be reveal the right to cut the throat of the devilish oppressor. Then in 1831, we know about Nat Turner's rebellion, but it was the rebellion in 1739. We talk about the police, but we need to understand who the police were and how they were formed and how they were created. They were created and originated for two reasons: to protect white property and to keep slaves in control. And so it was that when all of these ideas of rebellion began to rise in America, it created a great fear, so that in 1739, the Stonewall Rebellion took place in South Carolina. Blacks killed about 55 whites, hung their heads on sticks. And when whites found out this, a great fear arose, in addition to all of these other calls for revolt and rebellion. And so fear began to rise. Even so, as the Constitution was written, the Second Amendment, we need to know and understand that Dr. Carl T. Bogus, who was professor of law at Roger Williams College, in a very strong argument indicates that the reason for the Second Amendment was out of the fear of these white slave owners who, with the Constitution about to be ratified, Patrick Henry and others from the South didn't want this newly formed power of the federal government in an indirect manner develop a strategy that would not allow them to protect themselves from the possibility of slaves who would revolt. And so they established the slave patrols. And who were the slave patrols? The poor whites, most of them Irish. And that's why we call it the paddies and the paddy wagons. They had been enslaved in Ireland for anywhere from 700 to 1,000 years. They couldn't vote. They couldn't have citizenship. They had no rights. And yet they came to America and were enforcers of the same thing that they had been subject to. So they paid them a few dollars to go around every night and make sure that no black had a knife or a gun or a stick. Laws were passed that every white person, every person except Negroes, had to have a gun. Even the women and children had to have a gun, and they had to have target practice 3 to 4 days a year. Michael Moore suggests in some of his writings that that may be the reason that so many whites have arsenals in their homes even today, because of the fear of the reprisal of many blacks out of all that has occurred and happened to them over the years. But how did this fear become crystallized? Give me another 5 minutes and I'll be through. How did this fear become crystallized into white supremacy? There was a white man by the name of Gregor Mendel who did some studies where he took 10,000 pea pods. Some of them were wrinkle pea pods and some of them were smooth pea pods. And he crossbred them. When he crossbred them, he found that the wrinkle pea pods dominated the smooth pea pods. He took that and created two terms, dominant and recessive, and then moved to apply this to human beings. He concluded then that because of the dominance of the black gene, whenever there was a mixing of the white gene with the black gene was dominant, even as the smooth peas were dominant, or rather the wrinkle pea pods were dominant over the smooth pea pods. From that, he came up with the understanding that black is dangerous, that black can annihilate, that black can destroy white. And so it was in the ratification of the United States Constitution in 1790, William Lawton giving his speech of 2 hours before the Constitutional Ratification Convention said that if blacks are made to be free
and we abolish slavery, they will marry whites, and the white race will become extinct. That's a very important book of research by Edwin Black, a Jew who did many years of study of the development of the war on the weak in America. And it was that he then chronicled the eugenics movement. It was after Mandela had come up with his studies. It was that the ratification of the Constitution that Loughton made his statements, and then Francis Galton introduced the word eugenics, which means well-born. He concluded, and this is the beginning of this whole idea of eugenics. Eugenics means well-born. And he concluded that only the Nordics, those who were, quote, the pure northern white race, were pure in their blood. And any other group of people, including the Irish, including the Italians, were undesirables and unfit, and even the poor whites. And a campaign was developed with the Cold Harbor Laboratories in upstate New York that were funded by a few great rich persons in America, the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation, along with the great intellectual minds of America from Harvard and from Stanford. And these minds came together to devise means by which to destroy those they considered to be undesirable, the Irish, the Italians, the poor whites, and of course, most importantly, the blacks, because of their black skin, they were the most dominant. So this fear crystallized into a fear of genetic annihilation, that if they did not develop a means by which not only they could dominate a world in which 7/8 of the population were people of color, but at the same time ensure that those masses of people who so greatly outnumbered them, as they began to do in the time of slavery, would rise up and begin to control the world. So we must understand that white supremacy is a system that is designed to dominate not only America, but the entire world, and to maintain the status quo. So no lynching of one black person, no murder of one Emmett Till, no killing of the Prince of Peace, Martin Luther King, no assassination and the murder of any number of black people in this country will automatically move toward the dismantling of white supremacy, until this feeling of fear is addressed, and the root of that fear is addressed, which so Dr. Frances Welsing so aptly addressed in her book, The ISIS Paper, and in the Crest Color Theory. This notion of white supremacy will fight on and find the ways every time a law has been passed. Yeah, Congress may pass a couple of laws, but what has happened? History records that every time, many times, those laws are overcome. You have to understand a law is of no importance unless it is consistently enforced. And the history has been, from affirmative action and any other law that has been passed, every time the clock moves forward, a way to maintain the dominance and control of white supremacy has been passed to turn that clock back. So what is the answer? How can we address it? I don't know if it was in the minds and the spirits of that few rich who, after Emancipation Proclamation, controlled 90% of the wealth. And here we are in 2020, that less than 1% of the population still controls 90% of the wealth. I don't know if the will is within them, because in their genetic memory, and I'm wrapping this up, just as when you saw the lynching of George Floyd, it was not the first lynching that you have seen. It was in your genetic memory. And as my dear brother Naeem Akbar recounts, he calls it the residual effect. When you see something like that, there is a genetic recall in your subconscious. So you've seen not only George Floyd's lynching, but you've seen thousands of lynchings of black men and women. And equally for our white counterparts who promote white racism and white supremacy, they continue to have in their genetic memory the fear of genetic annihilation and the fear based on numerical inadequacy that causes them every time they see black men and women about to rise. In their computer, it says, we must do something to oppress them. We must do something to kill them. We must do something to destroy them. The only way, I will say this in closing, when people suffer from severe trauma, as white supremacy and white capitalism does in terms of its fear of black people and people of color, which is called that trauma, that severe trauma is called post-traumatic stress syndrome. In the military, when military individuals see their fellow soldiers' head blown off or some other kind of traumatic experience, they have found at one center to deal with those who have post-traumatic stress syndrome, the most effective way of healing it is to take them back to the very place where they saw what they saw and experienced what they experienced to bring about a cure in their post-traumatic stress disorder. I would submit to you that until white supremacists have the notion to go back to the very beginnings of this great fear, and therefore the concomitant desire to dominate and control not only all oppressed people in America, but all over the world, white supremacy will still find ways to very calculatingly and in very subtle ways put their fingerprint on white supremacy without changing it, but finding little ways that would appear to change something, but do not change it. That's my word for you tonight. While I have hope, I am not hopeful because I've seen this rodeo before. Be vigilant, be prayerful, and trust in Almighty God, because it is God that has kept us and sustained us through the wicked perpetration of white supremacy. God bless you all. I love you, and may God's Spirit be with you, in you, through you, and for you, because where God is, there can be no imperfection. My latest book is out, The Birth of the Bible, which traces the birth of the Bible from Africa to its present state here in America and across the world. If you'd like to have a copy of that book, you can go to the Union Temple Baptist Church website. It is available, plus the other volumes that I have written. Again, God bless you. Have hope, but understand this is an awesome monster called white supremacy that people have the intent and desire to dismantle. Good night.